In 1917, Vladimir Lenin became the leader of Russia after the infamous Russian revolutions months before. His aim was to create a communist nation of Russian people. After his death in 1924, Joseph Stalin followed in his footsteps in building the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR. His tactics in creating a strong communist government included total rule over the people. Stalin saw that the rest of the world was becoming more industrialized than Russia, and believed that in order to protect Russia from the threat of capitalism that filled Western Europe, the country must expand its industrial production. This totalitarianism government system expanded, and the supposed threat of capitalism that Stalin feared led to the creation of his 5-year plans. These plans involved mass industrialization and production and were impossible to achieve in the amount of time that Stalin set aside for them. However, Stalin found a way to make it possible. He arrested millions of minorities and enemies of the state to work in gulags or prison camps to speed up the process of these plans. One of these populations that Stalin sent to these camps were the Mennonite people, an ethnic and religious minority in the Soviet Union. The Mennonite population faced extreme hardships in Russia during Stalin's rule because of their ethnically German heritage, their religious practices, and their pacifism. The Mennonite religion was founded by Menno Simons in the Netherlands and spread throughout Europe. They are known as ethnic Germans because of their language and cultural practices, speaking a specific dialect of German called Plattdeutsch. The Mennonite people had originally come to Russia beginning in the 1790s to escape religious persecution in Western Europe. When they first settled in Russia, many of them relied on agriculture as their main way of survival. After the Mennonites were able to build their towns and way of life, the Russian government granted them self-governance and freedom to practice their religion. This would not last more than a little over 100 years, though, due to the communist revolutions in Russia in the early 1900s. In Stalinist Russia, beginning in 1924, the Mennonite populations were targeted because of the vast amounts of open land they owned for farming. Because of their success and productiveness as farmers, they were taken advantage of by the Red Army and Stalin. Maria Bargin, whose family lived in the Soviet Union, shared her experience with the Red Army in the film Through the Red Gate.
They came and swept everything away. They didn't leave us anything. Everybody had to bring everything to one place. You were not supposed to have any animals anymore. All the cows had to go in one barn. They belonged to the commune. And all the horses, they took everything away.
The Mennonites in Russia did not only lose their land, but many of them also lost their faith. Dr. John Martin said in an interview that his own father did not really know his Mennonite faith until his family had escaped to Canada because it was too dangerous to do so in Russia. Children were taken out of Mennonite schools by the Russian government and placed in state schools that taught them that religion is evil and that they were only allowed to practice atheism. Dr. Martins also said in this interview that children were encouraged to tell Russian authorities that if they heard their parents speak ill of Stalin, or if they practiced their religion behind closed doors. A large number of the Mennonite population were sent to gulags for being anti-Stalin. The Russian gulags were first started and used between the late 17th century and the earliest 20th century, under the rule of Russia's czars before the creation of the Soviet Union. Gulag is a Russian acronym meaning Main Administration Camp. Stalin operated his gulags from the 1920s until after his death in 1953. During this time period, the Gulag system acted as forced labor complex that imprisoned more than 18 million people and, at its height, was made up of hundreds of camps that could hold up to 10,000 people each. In order for his series of 5-year plans to be successful and for Russia to escape capitalism, prisoners in the gulags were forced to work dangerous industrial jobs and worked long days in extremely harsh conditions. The first groups of Gulag prisoners were criminals, peasant farmers, and landowners, who were called kulaks, meaning tight-fisted in Russian. These were people who also revolted against the Soviet government policy of collective farming, causing people who had little to have more, and people who were well off to have much less. Mennonites were one group among these farmers who often lost a lot of their wealth. Of the Mennonites that were taken by the Red Army, the majority of them were heads of families, usually fathers or church leaders. After those two groups, any opposing members of the Communist Party, as well as some military and government officials, were targeted. Later, regular citizens and anyone who associated with being anti-Stalinist were taken to the Gulag. Dr. John Martins, whose Mennonite grandfather was taken away by the Red Army in 1941, said in an interview that he believed that he was taken away not only because he was Mennonite, but perhaps because a neighbor had ratted him out for hiding farm animals from the Red Army, rather than participating in collective farming. Sometimes, in order to protect themselves, families would tell the Red Army rumors they had heard to get others arrested and make themselves appear pro-Stalin. Mennonite communities had settled across dozens of countries and territories, experiencing drastically different racial categorization in many of them. During the Nazi rule from 1933 to 1945, around 57,000 European Mennonites, along with millions of others, were filtered through a racial classification system that placed them in groups containing people of apparent similar origin. In Germany, Mennonites were almost always seen as Aryan, giving them favorable advantages, unlike their situation in Russia. The Nazi administration viewed Poland as a place to experiment with their racial policies. A German racial list categorized 4 groups of ethnic Germans that distinguished them from the Poles. Groups 1 and 2 consisted of ethnic Germans, differentiated by their German participation. Group 3 was individuals of German heritage, who had the potential to become full members of the German racial community, and Group 4 was made up of individuals of German heritage who committed themselves to Poland. All of the 8,500 Mennonites living in Nazi-occupied Poland who did not already have German citizenship fell into groups 1 and 2. Most of these Mennonites were qualified to obtain German citizenship, which many saw as a good thing, demonstrating their support for Hitler and Nazi Germany. Between 1939 and 1942, the Ethnic German Office was able to relocate thousands of ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union to German-occupied Poland, which included around 500 Mennonites. Desperate to get away from Stalin's Red Army, Mennonites agreed to support the Nazis and join the Nazis' Home to the Reich program. When Germany broke the non-aggression agreement with the Soviet Union in 1941, it forced 35,000 more Mennonites in Ukraine into Nazi rule, while 110,000 other Mennonites remained under Stalin's command. Mennonites in this region had been faced with starvation, collectivization, imprisonment, and forced labor in the Gulag under Stalin's ethnic cleansing policy of German-speaking populations, so they saw the Nazis as saviors. The Nazi administration once again wanted to integrate the ethnic Germans of Ukraine into the German racial group, so another German racial list was created specifically for Ukraine. With Germany's retreat westward in 1943, the evacuation of 200,000 ethnic Germans, which included 35,000 Mennonites, was ordered in Ukraine, and many were relocated to German provinces before Germany's final defeat in 1945. After Germany's defeat, one of the jobs of the United Nations was to fix the refugee problem that was caused by the war. One way they attempted to do this was through the same techniques the Nazi administration used. Racial categorization happened in order to decide which populations were guilty or innocent for their part in the war. The International Refugee Organization would only help individuals categorized as Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, and excluded people of German descent, as well as those who fled into Germany to avoid being captured by Allied armies. This post-war Polish agreement would not allow Mennonite citizens to come back, and they feared repatriation to the Soviet Union, knowing punishment or death would face them if they returned. Most Mennonites resettled under Nazi control during the war. However, thousands still wished to leave Europe and sought the help of international Mennonite organizations, such as the Mennonite Central Committee in North America, in order to relocate to North or South America. To try and get by the International Refugee Organization section about ethnic Germans, the Mennonite Central Committee claimed that the Mennonite refugees were actually of Dutch descent and had been incorrectly categorized by the Germans. After facing racial categorization once more, almost all Mennonites that were considered ethnic Germans by the Nazis were now passed as non-Germans. This allowed for the Mennonite Central Committee to organize the migration of over 15,000 Mennonite refugees from Europe to North and South America, including countries like Canada, where the Martins and Bargan families escaped to.